Welcome to Excel Data Analysis video number 1. In this video, we're going to learn about pivot tables and formulas. Now to follow along, you'll need to download these files in the link below the video. Now our goals are to use Power Query to import the data, use formulas to create the data model, and then from that data model, use a standard pivot table to create our reports and our Excel line chart. Here's the 4 reporting goals. The first report we need to create is a common report where we need total sales by year and month, and then we need a line chart to show how sales are changing over time. Next is a region by year sales report that shows the change year over year. Then we have to calculate the average monthly sales for each one of these products. Finally, we'll have to calculate a sales report, which is a cross tab that shows supplier at the top of the column and years at the head of the row. Now with data analysis, it always starts with the data. Now we have the product price table and the sales rep region table in the worksheet. Now, very importantly, our data is stored in a proper data set, also known as a table. A table has field names in the first row. That's the name of the data in each column, and then records in subsequent rows. Now, if your data is not stored in a proper data set, you can't even use the data analysis tools. In addition, if the table is stored in the Excel worksheet, then you have to have empty cells all the way around your table, or else the data analysis features will not work. Now our sales data comes to us in an external text file. Text files are common ways to get data from one system to another system. Now we have a .txt. There's also CSV. Let's go take a look at this file. Now here's the file. If you click up in the Windows Explorer address bar, that file path is going to be used by Power Query to get the data into Excel. Now let's go look at the file. And I don't want to open it in Notepad, so I'm going to right-click, Open with Word. Now I have my non-printing characters turned on because we got to figure out how this file gets a full table from one system to another. And the way it does it is with something called a delimiter. A delimiter is the character that separates each bit of data. And that arrow tells us that the delimiter separating the bits of data is a tab character. If you have a CSV file, the delimiter is a comma. And that becomes important when we import data. We can also see date, product ID, sales rep ID, and units. There are 4 fields in this table. Now, when importing data into the Excel worksheet and later, next video, into the Power Pivot data model, we go to the Data Ribbon tab in Excel and then to the Get and Transform group. We have a text or CSV file, so I'm going to click this button. You have to navigate to the correct location, select the file, click Import. In this window, very importantly, it wants to know what the delimiter is. It's a tab, and we can see that it interpreted that crazy text file as a proper data set. Now we want to click Transform Data. This allows us to look at the data in the Power Query editor before we import it. So if there's any trouble, we can fix it in Power Query. So I click Transform Data. This is the Power Query window. Over here, we can see the name of the query. This will become the name of the table that's imported into the Excel worksheet. There's our table. Over here on the right, there's 1, 2, 3 applied steps in this query. Now, if we look at the source and click the gear icon, and this is where the file path is listed. If you need to change it, you can come here later. When I close this, in every query that you create, the source step tells you the source of the data. Now notice when the file came in, it was a text file. So everything, including the field names, were just considered text. Notice everything is aligned to the left. The next step, it promoted the headers. We need those because none of the data analysis tools work unless we have a proper data set. And then watch this. Everything is text right now. If we tried to make a calculation in a pivot table on a text number, it wouldn't work. If we select the change type step, we can see it got the data types correct. The dates and all the numbers are aligned to the right. Now from our Excel skills, we can tell that these are all numbers because numbers are aligned to the right. But very importantly, at the top of each field, there's a symbol that tells you what the data type is. And if it didn't get it right, although it usually gets it right, you can easily change it. This is a data type icon. You can click on it. And there's your list of data types. Date is fine for these. 1, 2, 3 is the symbol for whole numbers for all of these. So Power Query got all 3 steps correct. Now we can load it. Home, the close group, close and load dropdown, and we want to select close and load to. This opens up the import data dialog box. Now we can load it as a table. You can load it directly to a pivot table or a pivot chart. If the full table is complete, then you don't even have to worry about loading it to the worksheet. We want to load the data to the table because we have to look up prices and calculate revenue and things like that. Later, we'll see how to use this option to load the data to the Power Pivot data model. I'm going to click Existing. I want to put it in A9 as a table. Click OK. And there's our imported table. Over here in Queries and Connection, there's the query. If you hover, you can see the load location to the worksheet. There's the data source. Now, this pane sometimes is not open, and you need to open it to look at your queries. Get and Transform is part of Power Query, but also Queries and Connections is part of Power Query. If I click, the pane goes away. Click again, I can see all my queries. Now, step 1 of our data analysis process is done. We used Power Query to import our text file and the other 2 tables we had here at the outset. Now, if we're going to use the amazing Insert Pivot Table, we have to have one flat table. And what that means is that we have to add an extra column and calculate the sales for each row. And not only that, we're going to have to go and look up product, supplier, and the region and bring it back to this table. When you use the standard pivot table, every field that you want to summarize and every condition and criteria for the calculations in the reports and visualization have to be in one table. Now, this will be totally different when we get over to Power Pivot and Power BI. There, we don't even need an extra sales column because the formulas we build in the pivot tables do it automatically, and we can use multiple tables. All right, let's build this flat table. Now, when we take our data and prepare it for the final reports and charts, that's called data modeling. Now, our first task is to take units times the price that we'll look up and calculate sales in an extra column. Now, this is an Excel table, so when I type the field name and hit Enter, a new field is automatically added to the Excel table. Equals, and if you've been around a long time, you know how to use the VLOOKUP function to look up product ID and go and get the price. But we're using Microsoft 365. And there's a better function than VLOOKUP. It's called XLOOKUP. Now, XLOOKUP is different in a few ways. One is the default is exact match. In the old VLOOKUP, the default was approximate match. And there's a few other differences. We're going to look up product ID, comma, and lookup array. There's no more table like in VLOOKUP. The second argument requires that you highlight the column with the items you're going to try and match from the lookup value. Now I type a comma. Return array. Instead of highlighting a table like in VLOOKUP, we simply highlight the field that contain the items we want to potentially go look up and bring back to the cell. Now that's it for our formula because the default is exact match lookup. But comma, You could put a message or a value in case you get an error, comma. These are the different types of match modes. In the old VLOOKUP, there was only exact match and approximate match, comma. And then you can actually tell it how to search. The bottom two we don't use because that's the old VLOOKUP way. But you can search first to last and last to first. Now, we don't need any of those. We're going to keep the defaults for all of them. So that's our formula when we do exact match lookup. Close parentheses. And now this is an Excel table. So when I hit Enter, the formula automatically copies down to every row. Now, this formula isn't completed. So in the top cell, I hit F2 times our units. And now when I hit Enter, there's our sales column. Now, if I click in the top cell and hit F2, I want to take a closer look at these references. These are not cell references. These are references from our Excel table objects. Anytime you refer to an entire column, you have the table name. The name of that table is dProduct. And then in square brackets, the field name. Anytime you refer to an individual cell in the same row as the formula, you have to use the implicit intersection operator, the @ symbol. That means from this entire product ID column, please get whatever's in this row. Now we're going to need the product name, so equals XLOOKUP. I'm going to look up using my arrow keys, product ID, comma. There's the column to try and get a match, comma. And this is the column that contains the items I want to go look up and bring back to the cell. Now, why did Microsoft change from a table to putting in two columns? Because what used to happen is people would insert a column into the lookup table, and then the old indexes that we used to put in there would break. But with this, that'll never happen. All right, that's our formula. Close parentheses and Enter. Now I need to look up supplier. Equals XLOOKUP product, comma. Get a match there, comma. Return the values from there, close parentheses, and Enter. The last column we're going to need is region equals XLOOKUP. And this time we're looking up sales rep ID, comma. Trying to find a match there, comma. And we're going to return the region. None of our reports are going to require sales rep, so we're not going to look up that column. When I hit Enter and adjust some of the column widths, we have our flat table, and we're done with our data modeling. Now we can build our pivot table reports. Now, the first report we want is a year and month sales report. And we want to notice that in the date column, we have the sales amounts and units amounts listed by day. There's no year or month column. That's no problem for the pivot table feature. It knows how to automatically roll all the dates and the associated numbers up into months and years. Now, to create your pivot table report, you click in a single cell in the proper data set, go up to the Insert Ribbon tab, Tables, and there's the pivot table button. The drop-down has some options. Your options may look slightly different, but the one we want is From Table and Range. Click. This is the Pivot Table from Table or Range dialog box. Yours may say Create Pivot Table, but both dialog boxes have Table and Range. And when you select a single cell, it'll automatically put the full table into the Table Range text box. Then down here, we get to decide where this report goes. We want to put it on an existing sheet with location selected. We'll click on Year Month Sales, B3, click OK. Now, the Pivot Table Fields task pane starts over here. I'm going to move it by grabbing it at the top. And what we have here is every field from the table. And to create our report, we drag whichever field we want down to columns, filter, rows, or values. Values is the area where we make our calculation. So that's where we drag our sales fields. These other ones are the conditions and criteria that sit on the outside of the report. Now, we want year and month down the rows. And we're going to see this amazing feature in a pivot table. We will, with our move cursor, click and drag. Notice the no symbol, no. If you hover in one of the four areas, notice that's the columns area. You see the green bar, but look at the icon. It'll show you that's the column area, filter, row, and that's the values. What we want is rows. And watch this. When I let go, it automatically creates 3 new fields, years, quarters, and for the moment, the month field is called date. And you can see up in our field list, there's the new fields. Here's the pivot table report. Let's select in the row area, right-click, expand collapse, expand entire field. Now wait a second. I don't even want quarter. We can click and drag off like this. Or if you want to remove, you can simply come up and uncheck. And that is amazing. Now, when you create a pivot table like this, it actually takes the entire table of data that we have in the worksheet, and it stores it in a temporary location called a pivot table cache. And down in that cache, it stored a new field called years and quarters. Now, I don't want quarters, so watch this. Let's come over somewhere in the row area and right-click and group. Click. This is the grouping dialog box. And if we click quarters, now the pivot table cache will no longer group by quarters. Also notice, if you needed to run an hourly sales report, like to look at peak sales for a website, that's an option. There are 7 options for grouping. And anytime you group, that means in the row area, it lists the conditions, which can be used in the conditional calculations in your report. Let's click OK. So that means in a standard pivot table, anytime you have the date field in the row area, you right-click, and you can choose what type of grouping you'd like to do. Now, another interesting thing is, notice that the months are sorted correctly, January to December. Now, of course, we would expect that. But over in Power BI, Desktop, and Power Pivot, month names like this are sorted alphabetically. So April will be on top. Now, there's an easy way to deal with that, and we'll see how to do that. Now, why does this work in a standard pivot table? Because File, Options, Advanced, and all the way at the bottom, there's a custom list right there. And that's what causes, in a standard pivot table, the month names to be sorted correctly. Now, let's drag sales down to values. And just like that, with a few clicks, we almost have our report. 2 things you need to do in what's called a standard pivot table. We will distinguish a standard pivot table from a data model pivot table. That's what Power Pivot creates. When you use a standard pivot table, you have to manually add number formatting and manually change the name of the calculation. To add number formatting to this calculation, it's not like the Excel worksheet cells. We don't have to highlight all the cells and add number formatting. We simply select one cell in the values area of the pivot table and right-click. We do not want format cells. We want the number formatting option. When you open this, it'll have a single tab, the number tab. Now, we could use currency or accounting, but lots of dollar signs clutter up the report. So we're going to select number, use a comma separator. I'm going to leave 2 decimals showing, but if you want a less cluttered report, you could show 0 decimals. Click OK. And now we've added our number formatting. Now we come up to the top cell. I'm going to click up in the formula bar and indicate the unit. And this is the name for this calculation column. We also want to click in C3 and name this field month. And that's our report. Now let's drag the task pane over to the right. And now we want to create our line chart to show the trends over time. I click in a single cell in our pivot table, Insert tab, over to the Charts group. And there's the line chart dropdown. We're going to select the first option. Now, to move a chart, you don't want to click inside, because if you try to move it there, it'll wreck it. You got to point to the outside edge. And when you see your move cursor, you click and drag. Now, anytime you do a visualization, the #1 rule is no chart junk. That means you look at each element in the visualization and decide, does it help to deliver the message? Well, right off the bat, this is a legend. And we don't need it because we only have one line. If you have multiple lines, then it's helpful to have a color-coded legend. I'm going to use the delete key. The word total as a chart title is not very good, so I'm going to click on the chart title, come up to the formula bar, and type total sales, and enter. Now we have total sales here and sum of sales here. That's unnecessary repetition. Also, these are called field buttons, and they govern how we can sort and filter this pivot chart. But guess what? The pivot table and pivot chart are connected. And I'm going to do the sorting and filtering over here. So right-click any field button and point to Hide All Field Buttons on Chart. That option is also up in Pivot Chart Analyze and then Field Button Dropdown. We can point to the little white circles and click and drag to make the chart wider. Now, when you create a chart, there's a green plus hovering on the right side. You can click and use the checkbox to remove or add different chart elements. I'm going to click Escape. Also, inside the chart, you can click on various elements and right-click to format. But a better way to get to the Format task pane is to select the elements you want. And we want to reduce the decimals to remove clutter. And then use the keyboard, Control-1. That opens up the task pane. Now, up at the top, we have different icons. All of these icons are governing what's going to happen to our vertical axis. We want this one here. Down under number, we can change decimal places 2 to 0. Tab. And when you click on a different chart element, the task pane adjusts. All right, I'm going to hold my Alt key and use the Move cursor. That snaps it to the grid. Let's click inside the pivot table, click on Field List, and we want to try to drag Product down to Filter, whereas the fields dropped into rows determine a different calculation for each row. When we drag Product down to Filter, we're allowed at the top of the pivot table to select a condition that will affect every calculation in the pivot table. So when I select Aspen, all these calculations are for Aspen, and the chart updates. Clicking at the top, selecting all, click OK. Now all the calculations are for all products. Now there's a user-friendly way to apply a filter. Now I'm going to click and drag this off. Pivot table selected up in Pivot Table Analyze, Filter Group. Let's click Insert Slicer. I want to check Product, click OK, and that is looking awesome. We can resize it. Because the slicer is selected, there's a Slicer Ribbon tab. You can change the colors, add different number of columns. But for us, this is fine. When I click Carlota, everything updates. Quad, I can hold the Control key and select 2 items. That means every calculation is showing for Quad or the Aspen product. For example, that calculation right there, the numbers used to calculate that sum from the original data set had the year equal to 2022 and the month equal to October and the product equal to Aspen or Quad. If I click on Carlota, now that cell has the conditions year equal to 2022, the month equal to September, and the product equal to Carlota. Fundamentally, that's what a pivot table does. It makes calculation based on conditions and criteria. Now that button right there, you can use that instead of the Control key to select multiple items. And when you want to clear the filter, you click the red X. Now every calculation is for all products. Our next report is a region year sales report. Now we already grouped by year, so when we go back over to the data set to start a new report, I click in a single cell, and instead of using this button, we're going to use the keyboard, Alt-NVT, hitting each key in succession. We want it on an existing sheet location, region sales. We're going to put it in B3. Click OK. And here we can see it still has years. That's because every time we create a new report, it uses the same cached data. Now that's a good thing Because if you had 10 reports and it recached the data each time, which it used to do in earlier versions of Excel, then your file would get really big. All right, we want region in rows. And I'm just going to check it because the default is to send a field like this to rows. Anytime you bring an item down to rows, it instantly gives you a unique list. We can do the same for years. When I check this, it puts it below, which is what we want. And it gives us a unique list for each one of the regions. Now we drag sales down to values. And each time we sum our sales, we have to add number formatting and change the name at the top. Right-click, number formatting. Number, use a separator, click OK. And we'll indicate the unit. All right, so that's sort of a hassle. And a data model pivot table and a Power BI report, we won't have that problem because the number formatting and the name of the calculation actually follow the calculation around. But this next calculation, where we need to calculate the sales change as a percentage year over year between each year, that type of calculation in a standard pivot table is much easier than any of the other tools we'll learn. Here's how you do it. You drag sales down to values. We have a duplicate. And to change the calculation, you click in any cell in the values area in the second column. And there's two ways we can change the calculation. Summarize values by allows you to change the function or the aggregate calculation. And show values as. This is amazing. Percent of grand total, percent of column total. Difference from, that would calculate the difference from year to year. This is the one we want. When I click the show values as, percent difference from dialog box pops up. Now notice it says sum of sale. If we had a different aggregate calculation like counting, then the percentage difference from calculation would work on the count. Now the base field, that's the field where we're trying to make the percentage difference from calculation. And the base item, that means what is the starting amount for each calculation. For us, it's going to be previous. So that way, in this row right here, here's the end amount. There's the previous start amount. Now when I click OK, not only does it make the calculation, but it adds the number formatting. The year over year percentage change from 22 to 23 is 28.89%. Now to illustrate how fast a standard pivot table can be, I want to do the same report off to the side, but instead of sum of sales, I want to count how many transactions there are. So we're going to go back to the data set, click inside the table, Alt-NVT, we'll put it on existing, region sheet, G3, click OK. Check region, check years. And when we drag a number field like sales down to values, it defaults to the aggregate calculation sum. But I'm going to pick a text field, and we're going to drag product down to values. Notice because the product field is text, it defaults to count. Now, this is not the actual count of product. It's actually counting how many transactions were in California for the year 2021. So I'm going to come up to the top and rename this. Number of transactions, and enter. We're going to drag product down again. Somewhere in the second values area, we click, right-click, show values as, and we'll do the same calculation, percent difference from. The base field will be years, and the base item will be previous. Click OK. And look at that, down more than 10%. That means this was the starting amount in 22. This was the ending amount in 23. So we went down by minus 10%. But this is counting transactions. Over here, this is the amount of the sales. And for the same time period, we went up in terms of amount of sales. But here we went down in terms of number of transactions. All right, both of these calculation names are terrible. We'll just call it percent change. Same over here. All right, so our second reporting task is done. region year sales report. Now, if we go back over to data sets, our third report is average monthly sales by product. And we're going to bump into the limitation of standard pivot tables here. The problem with this calculation is it says average monthly sales. And we do not have monthly amounts for every line in this data set. That means we have a problem with the size of the sales amount known as the grain of the table. The grain is at the transaction level. So what we need to do when we have calculations like this is we have to make an intermediate table and calculate the monthly sales amount for each product. To look at what one of these intermediate tables looks like, let's go over to the sheet average monthly sales by products. I had to calculate the total sales for each month for each one of these products in 4 different tables. Or we build one table where it lists each month and the product. Then we have to calculate, using a formula, the total sales for each product by month, and then calculate the average. Now, really, this is not what we should do. Once we have this problem, that means we don't use a standard pivot table. We jump over to a data model pivot table. Now, in this video, we're not going to make these calculations. We're just looking at it here as a preview for next video, where we get to learn how to use a data model pivot table. All right, our fourth report is going to be the easiest one by far. Year by supplier sales crosstab report. That means we need year and supplier as our conditions and the sales field in the values area. Select one cell in the table, Alt-NVT, existing, the location, our last sheet, B3, click OK. I'm going to check years to send it down to rows, supplier over to columns, sales down to values, right-click, number formatting. We'll add some number formatting. Change the name. Adjust the column width. Done. Now, fundamentally, when we do a cross-tab report, an intersecting cell is using an AND logical test. That means all the numbers used to calculate that sum came from transactions in the data set where the year is equal to 2022 and the supplier is equal to gel booms. Now, that's our third finished report. Now, notice we have data from the year 21 to 23. But what if we get new data? We have 3 different reports. And back here, we have a data set. These columns we imported using Power Query. These we created with Worksheet Formulas. But no problem. If we get new data, for example, here's an updated file with new data. We simply go back to Excel. And if your queries and connection pane is not showing, you click that button. We can go back into the query, right-click Edit, or simply double-click. This is the Power Query window. And remember, we said the first step, we can click the gear icon. You can use this button to go and navigate to the new file. But let me show you, if I close all of this, right in the Excel Data Ribbon tab, Get and Transform, we can click the Get Data and down to Data Source Settings. There's our connection. We can change the source. Click, so you have 2 locations to change the file. I want to click Browse. Navigate to the new file. I'm going to double-click it. Click OK. Click Close. And now, look over here. We have 606 rows. I can click that Refresh button, or right in the table, I can right-click Refresh. And here it's updating. It's got the new data. If I come over to the table and click Control down arrow to jump down to the bottom, it got the new data. And look at this. Up to the units, all of this was part of the new data. But those worksheet formulas all automatically got copied down. Control Home to jump back to the top. We updated this table. But remember, when you create a standard pivot table, that tool takes the data and caches the data. So if we look at the report, it's not updated yet. We have to come to any one of the pivot tables and right-click Refresh. That updates the pivot table cache, and we can see the new data, and we can see the sales went up from 2023 to 2024. If we go look at our region sales report, there's the new data. And look at this. 23 to 24 for California went up, but 23 to 24 for Washington went down. All right, in this video, we started it off by learning how to use Power Query to import data. Then we used Excel Worksheet Formulas to create a data model. We created a flat table so we could use the amazing Standard PivotTable tool to create our reports. And then we created a line chart. And importantly in this video, we saw that the Standard PivotTable has a few advantages over the other tools. And one of them is this amazing grouping ability where we can create a yearly, monthly sales report with just a few clicks. We also saw that the show value as calculation is similar. A few clicks and the calculation is done. And then we saw that a cross-tab report is fast and easy. Now stay tuned to next video, data analysis video number 2. We'll learn how to use Power Pivot, create DAX formulas, and data model pivot tables.